High-end escort work requires a level of social intelligence that most professions never demand. Reading people quickly, adjusting tone, anticipating what someone needs before they ask. Most of that work is invisible, and over time, those constant adjustments begin to organize something deeper. How you respond, how you regulate emotion, and eventually, how the work is experienced from the inside. That process is what this episode explores. As the founder of Psychologists for Escorts and creator of the Psychology for Escort framework, I help exceptional women understand the psychological impact of their work. This episode is part 1 of a 10-part introduction series. Across this series, we'll explore the psychological processes that gradually shapes the experience of high-end escort work. Women who begin escort work often start with very clear expectations. Financial independence, greater autonomy, control over time, and with it, often a sense of excitement. But very quickly, the work reveals something else. A level of interaction that requires constant awareness. Being attentive to subtle shifts in mood, sensing what someone needs in the moment, responding in ways that keep the interaction smooth. And in many cases, those expectations aren't wrong. Many women do gain financial independence. Many do experience a different life. But alongside those changes, something else begins to take shape. The internal structure the work gradually creates. Because high-end escort work involves something very specific. Continuous emotional calibration. Reading another person. Adjusting tone. Adjusting presence. Maintaining atmosphere. And each of those adjustments may feel small in the moment. A softer reaction, a longer smile, a moment of reassurance. But repeated thousands of times, those small adjustments begin to organize something deeper. They begin to shape the way the work is experienced. And this is where something important begins. A quiet assumption. An internal agreement you make with yourself about how the work will feel. Psychologists have a name for that. A psychological contract. A psychological contract is a set of inner rules you quietly create for yourself about the work. What you will feel, what you will ignore, and what parts of yourself are allowed to participate. Most of the time, those rules are never spoken out loud. But they shape how you approach the work, and how the work gradually shapes you. They can sound very simple. Ideas like, I'll stay emotionally detached. I'll stay in control. This is simply your role. Statements like these may seem simple, but there are small agreements you make with yourself about who you will be while doing the work. And over time, those agreements begin to influence how the work is experienced from the inside. And this rarely happens through dramatic events. Not through obvious turning points, but through repetition, through thousands of small adjustments that gradually reorganize how the mind and nervous system respond. And understanding that process is where real clarity begins. This episode focuses on the first step in that process, the psychological contract, the inner agreement you make with yourself about the work. Because the psychological effects of this work rarely appears in one moment. They unfold gradually, before the work, during the work, and often long after it ends. And once that inner agreement is in place, other processes begin to follow. You may notice your boundaries become more flexible than you expected. Emotional responses become easier to regulate. And over time, the way you experience yourself in the work can begin to shift. In the episodes ahead, we'll explore how these processes unfold step by step. But first, we need to go back to the beginning. Because the psychological contract, that inner agreement, doesn't appear out of nowhere. It usually begins before the work even starts, long before the first client. Because before the work begins, most women carry a few quiet expectations. And those expectations gradually form a story about what the work will be like. That story is what we call a fantasy, and almost every woman entering the work has one. And the fantasy isn't a lie, it's not a mistake. It's a framework the mind creates to make something unfamiliar feel manageable. And inside that fantasy, a psychological contract quietly forms. An inner agreement about how the work will unfold, what it will give, what it will cost, and which parts of yourself will remain untouched. So, to understand the psychological contract, we first have to understand the fantasy that creates it. And most women enter the work with more than one. We look at 5 fantasies, because each of them creates a slightly different psychological contract. And each contract shapes how the work is experienced over time. But first, we need to understand what a fantasy actually is. Every woman enters escort work with a fantasy, a story, a way of making sense of what she is about to do, and who she believes she will be while doing it. That fantasy isn't stupid, it's functional. Because when people step into something unfamiliar, the mind creates a narrative that makes it feel manageable. A way to explain the decision to yourself. A way to predict what the experience will be like. And a way to believe that certain parts of you will remain unchanged. Most women enter the work with several fantasies. And each of those fantasies quietly forms a psychological contract. An inner agreement about how the work will feel. And how you believe you will be while doing it. Let's begin with the first one. For many women, the first fantasy is financial freedom. More money in less time, more options, more choice. And in many cases, this part is real. Money changes possibilities. It reduces dependence. It creates space. Space to make decisions differently. Space to leave situations that once felt unavoidable. Space to imagine a future that wasn't possible before. Financial freedom can feel powerful, and for many women it is. But what's often underestimated isn't the income. It's the meaning money starts to carry when it's earned through intimacy. Because money earned through emotional and physical presence doesn't stay neutral for long. It begins to attach itself to decisions. Money begins to shape what feels acceptable, what feels temporary, what feels worth tolerating. Not in dramatic ways, rarely in one obvious moment, but gradually. Because money introduces a powerful feedback signal. The interaction goes well, the client is satisfied, and the reward arrives. And the mind learns from that pattern. It learns which responses lead to reward. So over time, money doesn't just reward behavior, it begins to guide it, quietly shaping what you accept, what you adjust, and what you tell yourself is only temporary. And none of that means the fantasy was wrong. Financial freedom can absolutely be real. But the fantasy rarely includes something else. The psychological weight money gradually begins to carry. And that weight slowly becomes part of the contract, an inner agreement about what the work is worth and what parts of yourself are negotiable. And that's where the next fantasy begins. Money is only one part of the story. Another fantasy is autonomy. I choose my clients, my schedule, my boundaries. And in many ways, this is part of the appeal. Escort work can offer a level of flexibility that many conventional careers don't. You can decide when you work, who you see, how much you take on, compared to many traditional jobs that can feel like real freedom. And in many cases, it is. Escort work can offer more control than many conventional paths. But autonomy inside a market is never absolute. Because once money enters the interaction, choice begins to shift. Not dramatically, rarely in one obvious moment, but in small negotiations. A client you might not have chosen, but the timing feels right. A booking that stretches slightly longer than you originally planned. A situation where the boundary is still there, but the context makes it more flexible. And each of those moments is a negotiation. Not just with the client, but with yourself. A quiet calculation about what feels acceptable, what feels temporary, what feels worth adjusting. And over time, those negotiations accumulate. They shape how you interpret your choices. They shape how flexible your boundaries feel. And eventually, they begin to shape how you see yourself. Because autonomy doesn't disappear, but it becomes contextual, influenced by timing, by opportunity, by financial signals. And slowly, the contract adapts. The inner agreement shifts slightly, not because autonomy was an illusion, but because autonomy in this kind of work is always negotiated, again and again. And that negotiation introduces another fantasy, control over desire. Some women expect a sense of control, to be wanted while being financially compensated, to be admired while remaining unattainable, to experience desire without attachment. And for many women, that idea can feel powerful, especially if you have ever felt powerless before, if desire once meant vulnerability, if being wanted once meant losing control. In that context, the structure of escort work can appear to reveal the dynamic. You are desired, but you remain in charge. You receive admiration, but you decide how close anyone gets. And that can feel empowering. For many women, it genuinely is. But control that depends on performance has to be maintained. Because the experience of being desired in this context is not spontaneous. It's structured, maintained through attention, through responsiveness, through emotional calibration. And that means the sense of control is connected to something else. Effort. the effort of maintaining the interaction, maintaining the atmosphere, maintaining the version of yourself that the situation requires. And maintenance is work, psychological work. Because maintaining control over desire means constantly regulating two things: the expectations of the client and your own emotional distance. Over time, that regulation becomes faster, more automatic. But it still requires energy. And that energy becomes part of the contract. The inner agreement about how desire will be handled. Not eliminated, not ignored, but managed. And that management slowly shapes how desire itself is experienced. Not only in the work, but sometimes outside of it as well. And for many women, that's where another fantasy becomes important: emotional distance. Many women believe emotional distance will protect a part of who they are. That it forms a clear boundary between the work and personal life. I won't get attached. I won't take it home. I'll keep it separate. And this distance can be protective. Creating separation between roles can make emotionally complex work manageable. For many women, that separation feels essential. But emotional distance isn't a personality trait. It's an ongoing effort, something that has to be actively maintained, because the work itself requires connection. Not deep personal intimacy, but momentary emotional responsiveness. Listening closely, responding warmly, maintaining presence. And each of those responses creates a small emotional movement, a shift in tone, a change in energy, a moment of attunement. Distance in that context doesn't mean absence of feeling. It means regulating how much of yourself participates. And regulation requires attention. Attention requires effort. And effort costs energy. At first, that effort may feel minimal, almost automatic. But over time, the effort required to maintain that distance begins to accumulate. Not as a crisis, but as a subtle psychological load, part of the contract. The inner agreement about how much of yourself is allowed to be present and how much must remain outside the interaction. And over time, maintaining that distance becomes part of the work itself. And that leads to perhaps the most important fantasy of all. I'll stay myself. I'll play a role, but it won't touch who I am. The role is temporary, and the real self remains separate. That idea can feel reassuring, because it suggests that identity remains stable. That what happens inside the work stays inside the work. And for many women, that belief feels necessary. Without it, stepping into the role would feel much more uncertain. So the mind creates a clear distinction. There's the role and there's the self. But roles don't only shape behavior, they shape perception as well. Because every role organizes attention. What you notice, what you respond to, how quickly you adjust. Over time, that organization becomes familiar, almost automatic. Certain reactions become faster. Certain emotional responses become quieter. And gradually, the boundary between role and self becomes more complex. Not because identity disappears, but because perception begins to shift. And perception shapes identity. The way you interpret interactions, the way you regulate emotion, the way you read other people. All of those processes slowly organize how the self experiences the world. Which means the role never stays entirely outside the self. It leaves traces, and those traces become part of the contract, the inner agreement about who you believe you will remain while doing the work. And that's why these fantasies matter. None of these fantasies, or the expectations they carry, are naive. They describe something real. They describe what the work can offer. But they rarely describe what the work quietly asks in return. Because every fantasy that helps someone enter the work also creates a psychological contract, an inner agreement about how the experience will unfold. What you will allow yourself to feel. What you will keep at a distance. And which parts of yourself you believe will remain unchanged. The fantasy helps women step into the work, but the psychological contract begins shaping who they become while staying. Often that contract sounds very reasonable at first. As long as I stay in control, I stay safe. As long as I don't feel too much, I won't be affected. As long as this is temporary, it won't shape me. And none of those thoughts are irrational. They are ways of making the unknown manageable. Ways of entering a complex environment with a sense of structure. But over time, those inner agreements begin to influence how the work is experienced from the inside. And that difference between what the work promises and what it gradually organizes internally is rarely talked about. This episode was about the beginning of that process, the fantasies women carry into the work, and the psychological contract those fantasies quietly create. In the episodes ahead, we'll explore how those contracts begin to unfold, how boundaries shift, how emotional regulation changes, and how, over time, the work can begin to change how you experience yourself. This series isn't about telling you what to think. It's about helping you see what usually stays invisible. So, if you recognize yourself in parts of this episode, what follows will likely feel familiar. In the next episode, we'll talk about mental preparation. Because most women prepare for safety and presentation, but very few prepares for the psychology of the work. And before the work changes anything externally, the mind has already begun adjusting internally.